Hi, I'm Bram, and let's talk about fascism for a bit. You know, that old-timey ideology from days long gone?
Fascism is an inherently backward-looking ideology. One of the core tenets of fascism is a desire to return to some imagined prelapsarian point in history where everything was supposedly pure and good. Fascists tend to view all of modern history as degeneration, and yes, that includes things like hard-fought civil rights for minorities and women. The words degeneracy and degenerate are words that both contemporary and historical fascists love to use to describe anything from soy-drinking men to mixed-race couples, and from any and all expressions of queerness to any kind of open display of sexuality. The perceived degeneration of society is seen as the result of all these smaller individual perceived degeneracies. To the point where some fascists will literally tell you that increased sexual promiscuity towards the end of the Roman Empire was the cause of its downfall, which is just gibberish on the face of it, because Romans were openly sexual and gay as fuck from the very beginning. Not gay in a good way, mind you. Ancient homosexuality had more to do with misogyny than with inclusivity, and there was a strict societal taboo in Roman society around being a bottom, but gay nonetheless. Fascists can admit that though, because many of them tend to see Rome as the ideal model for a society, but also simultaneously hate open displays of sexuality and queerness. Viking society is another big fixation of fascists, as they love to see themselves as traditionally masculine big boy conquerors and warriors, and also because of race stuff, even though their concept of whiteness is a construct that Vikings would not have been aware of. Anyway, my point is that fascism is an ideology centered around, among other things, an intense fear and distrust of any kind of societal change. It's part of a larger historical pattern in that sense, because Romans thought everything they were doing was shit compared to the ancient Greeks. The Greeks themselves thought they didn't have shit on the Egyptians, and even the earliest Egyptians thought everything used to be so much better in the past, which would be before the start of written history. To a somewhat lesser extent, conservatives fit this pattern too, although they tend to fetishize the 50s and 80s more than the Roman Empire. Watch this Curio video if you're interested in this. There's a popular question right-wingers like to ask, one they think is obviously rhetorical, which is emblematic of their fear of societal change and the connected ideas that many right-wingers have. Don't you want your grandchildren to look like you?
Let me answer that question the only way I know how, by going on an extended tangent about a post-human work of sci-fi literature.
Old Tomorrows is an ebook by C.M. Kosemen, written under the pseudonym Nemo Ramjet. It is a fictional future history of humankind, and it tells a story that can very much be described as a story of degeneration. After a drawn-out civil war between Earth and its own colony on Mars, humanity decided to genetically engineer itself into a version more capable of surviving space travel and thriving on alien planets, which they dub the Star People. They went on to spread across the galaxy, and soon after their colonization of the stars, and colonization is the right word here as they extinguished complete alien ecologies in the process, they experienced a bona fide golden age. It couldn't last forever though. First contact came in the form of the Q.
Damn you, Q!
Nope, wrong Q. These Q were an alien species that had mastered the arts of genetic manipulation and nanotechnology, and as they gained the ability to reshape entire worlds and species, they at one point picked up the notion that it was their religious mission to remake the universe as they saw fit. Which is exactly what they did with humanity. Insulted by humanity's hubris in reshaping entire worlds, which the Q saw as their calling, they used humans as the building blocks for a myriad of new species. Most of them hardly resembled anything we would recognize as human, and none of them were allowed to retain their sentience. Some were relatively lucky, like a species dubbed the Hedonists, which were basically bred to be the Q's purse dogs, and were allowed to live unencumbered lives of ceaseless pleasure, in a paradise that was engineered just for them. Most were not that lucky though. The other humanoid species were transformed into what can well be described as abominations on the whims of the Q. Take the Tempters, for example. The females of this species were bred to serve as nothing more than decoration for the Q, and the male's only purpose was to gather nutrients for the females and occasionally breed with them. Or take the world in which the Q placed both a predator and prey species of humanoids, making humanity's children and grandchildren hunt each other. Take the Striders, who were elongated to live on a planet with very little gravity, or the Lopsiders, who were squished and flattened to live on a planet with extreme gravity. Take the blind folk, who had the faculty of sight taken away from them and had to live in underground caverns, or the mantelopes, who were allowed to maintain sentience to be able to serve as living memory retainers and singers for the queue, but who had this conscience trapped in a body that afforded them no way to meaningfully manipulate the world around them. The human world that had managed to hold off the queue the longest was punished the worst for its defiance. They were turned into the colonials, who formed mats of human flesh that spread around the world like cancer cells. The difference is that these cells were all conscious human beings, who could do nothing but suffer in silence and involuntarily breed more of themselves. More colonials who would also be doomed to a life of suffering. After a while, the queue just left, presumably moving on to the next civilization to mangle. Many of their post-human creations couldn't fend for themselves and died out. This story so far sounds like a nightmare to any human being with an ounce of empathy, but it will also be particularly scary to fascists, who will see many of their worst fears confirmed in it. Humanity used genetic engineering to transform themselves into something new and different than they were before, and as punishment, they are doomed to a fate of further and further degeneration into something that can by no means be called civilized, and which in many cases actively leads to epoch-spanning periods of suffering for humanity's descendants. Had the text stopped here, it could be read as a pro-fascist cautionary tale. Don't stray from tradition, for tradition holds wisdom, and any attempt to stray from it will only lead to further and further degeneration. Only the text doesn't stop here, and I don't think fascists would like where it goes from here. Because the fate of humanity in this story isn't further and further degeneration. For a very select few of these post-human species, their conditions were such that they gradually re-evolved human intelligence, and these species eventually re-established societies. For some, these societies came about through centuries of war. This is the case for the Sail people, who were initially divided into warrior tribes and pirate nations, whose conflicts lasted centuries. The asymmetric people were genetically engineered ancestors of the Lopsiders, who, not long after colonizing a world with more forgiving gravity, nuked the Lopsiders out of existence. The Tyrosapiens, however, managed to unite without much conflict, because their power of flight made them a global society before they could even invent such things as nations and borders. Yes, this story does imply that the existence of nations inherently leads to conflicts, which... yes. There's also the modular people, who came about when the colonials finally evolved out of their cycle of constant suffering. The modular people were colonies of several sentient post-human beings, who split off and recombined as the situation required. The story tells us that these people lived in a peaceful utopia, because everyone was happy to be part of a greater cooperative whole, which... also yes. Eventually, over tens of millions of years, 11 of these human societies came in contact with each other, and formed the Second Galactic Empire. This was really only an empire in name, as the distances between these societies was too vast for them to meet person to person. The exchange of information and culture between them led to never-before-seen levels of welfare and cultural and technological progress. One thing I love about this story is that these human societies, despite the fact that you could never tell they were related on first glance, recognized each other's shared humanity nonetheless. Even the Saurosapiens, who evolved not from humanoids but from their livestock and who had since turned that dynamic around, riding on the back of humanoids, are allowed into the Second Galactic Empire. They evolved amidst the ruins of human civilization and have had hundreds of millions of years to soak up the remains of their culture, so what does it matter if they technically share an ancestry or not? Not only does the story recognize the humanity of all these seeming abominations, but it successfully invites the reader to do the same. They may look nothing like us anymore, but Kosemen makes sure to communicate their humanity through their actions. This dinosaur-looking motherfucker is actually a woman posing for a photo on vacation in front of a seaside resort. This guy is literally a parasite on top of an unrelated alien species that evolved in parallel with it, but the text tells us that he watches television, or smells television, and goes to work every day. This man may look like Picasso's interpretation of a caterpillar, but when the caption tells me that he's posing nude for this photo, I can't help but think that that's an incredibly human thing to do. These people may look more like a velociraptor than they look like me, but they're literally going to a concert, and this snake guy is reading a book while listening to music. As alien as they may seem on the surface, just beneath that surface are unmistakable signs of humanity. A fascist would tell you that change would eventually turn us into something unrecognizable as human, and in their mind, they would probably be right. They probably wouldn't be able to empathize with any of these monstrous-looking people. Anyone with an ounce of empathy can, though, if they're willing to look for more than a moment. This story shows how change can both be a really good thing and a really bad thing. It can be both progress and regression. Change in itself is value neutral, so it doesn't make sense to hold on to tradition for the sake of it. To take it back to the beginning of this essay, let me answer the question, would I want my great-great-grandchildren to look like this? And my answer is, sure, why not? If they're happy and thriving in this society, why would I care if they look like me? The future is not for me, it's for those who have to live in it. If you had asked a prehistoric reptile if they wanted their descendants to look like me in 300 million years, and if that reptile could actually understand the question and respond to it, they likely would have said, ew, no, what kind of thing is that even? I for one am glad though that they didn't get a say in that, because I quite like not being a reptile. There's another part to this story though, one I would say is pretty explicitly anti-fascist. Let's talk about the Ruin Hunters. Out of all the Q's malformations of humanity, the Ruin Hunters were perhaps given the most advantages when it came to re-establishing human civilization. The Q had not been as thorough in destroying the remains of human society on their world, which meant that a treasure trove of knowledge was still waiting for the Ruin Hunters among the ruins of the old world. The Q were similarly negligent in the genetic modification of the Ruin Hunters themselves, as they were not only among the most recognizably human of all the experiments, but their intelligence was also not wiped out as thoroughly. It had been numbed, of course, but they had only been set back to the level of apes, and they quickly redeveloped human levels of intelligence. So aside from some world-ending natural disaster, what could go wrong? A lot, as it turns out. In the long run, their knowledge about the old world would prove less than fortunate for humanity. It may have hastened the Ruin Hunters' road to civilization, but it also imbued them with something the book calls an autochthonous madness. They had convinced themselves that they were the only true descendants and the sole legitimate heirs of the legacy of the Star People. To quote the book, they were ready and willing to do anything to claim their fictitious bygone golden age. So they became fascists. This is not up for debate, they just did. They became a society obsessed with reclaiming a prelapsarian golden age, and in doing so, they became obsessed with purity and heritage. They may be mistaken in thinking that they are the only descendants of this imagined master race, but surprise, surprise, so are fascists. Ancient Romans and Greeks were not as racially homogeneous as these people would like to believe, and white supremacist fascists have often bent over backwards to try to convince themselves that the ancient Egyptians were actually white, so they could maintain the narrative that only white people could achieve their level of civilization. Even though, no, they fucking weren't. The civilization of white people didn't just magically appear in the North African desert. The wrongness of real-life fascist and white supremacist beliefs has not, however, stopped them from having horrific real-world consequences, and the same would prove true for the Ruin Hunters. When the Ruin Hunters finally encountered their human cousins, they had changed quite a bit. To survive the rapid expansion of their sun, they had to radically transform themselves. No kind of organic being could survive the conditions they would soon have to live under, so they had to turn themselves into floating machines and became a new species known as the Gravitals. The first generation of Gravitals still housed the brains of the last organic Ruin Hunters, but subsequent generations had entirely mechanical brains. Humanist King C.M. Kosemen reminds us though that the Gravitals are still human, even in their completely mechanical form. Their machine brains still possess human dreams, human ambitions, and yes, human delusions of grandeur. At first this read to me as a bit of a #not-all-fascist kind of take, but in the end I was glad that he didn't imply that the entire species was bad, because bioessentialism is bullshit, and stories like that invite readings by certain people that you may want to avoid. Anyway, when the Second Galactic Empire made contact with the Gravitals, it did not go well for humanity. The Gravitals ruthlessly slaughtered the entire population of all these worlds, using the advantage they had gained because of their evolutionary and technological head start. This could only be described as a genocide on an unimaginable scale, but it was not, as you might expect, born out of hatred. The Gravitals' conception of purity had gone so far that they simply did not see any of humanity's grandchildren as human or even as people anymore. In their certainty that they were the only truly human beings in the universe, they almost entirely wiped out humanity. Aside from them, the only humans to survive in some way were the bug facers, whose genetic material the Gravitals used to genetically engineer human abominations for manual labor and entertainment, just as the Q once had. The story of the Ruin Hunters and Gravitals can be read as a cautionary tale against fascism by anyone who already opposes fascist ideas, but I will admit that a fascist may see this differently. They might see this as a story of a perfected humanity that harnessed the tradition and wisdom of the past to root out any impurities. But again, the story does not end here. The machine empire of the Gravitals was, as Kosemen reminds us, not homogeneous in their views. Their regime may have been quite undeniably fascist and genocidal, but there were other political factions that disagreed with the wholesale extermination of all other human species. After the extermination event, an ever-increasing group of machines came to understand humanity's common origin and the universal dignity of all life. Some machines even fell in love with the organic human species they had engineered as their subjects. This led to discord within machine society, and eventually even led to a short but bitter civil war. This is an inherent practical flaw of fascism. As purity is defined narrower and narrower, it becomes easier and easier to see the absurdity of this definition. And what can an us versus them regime really do when the us doesn't agree on who should be defined as them, or doesn't even agree anymore that a distinction should be made in the first place? The short-term answer is violence against your own people, as I just described, but how often can that be a viable answer until there's not enough fascists left to populate your empire? The machine leadership eventually chose a different solution, one that leaders often employ when they're losing the support of too many of their citizens. They ignited a war with another outside entity to give the rival factions a common enemy to band against. The civilization they decided to start a war with were the astromorphs, a species of human I have not talked about yet for dramatic effect. There actually was a group of humans that had managed to evade the Q invasion altogether all those hundreds of millions of years ago. These were the Star People who, rather than trying to stave off the Q, got into their ships and retreated into space. They never landed anywhere though, choosing instead to hollow out entire asteroid fields to create enormous ships in which they could form their new society. They adapted through evolution and presumably genetic engineering to live in an off-world environment. Their digestive systems were pressurized, their bones and limbs grew spindlier and longer, and they came to move themselves about using jets of air expelled from their modified anuses. Yep, these people moved around by farting. These humans were called the Spacers. Over time, they learned to thrive in their new environment, and eventually joined all their ships together into a giant indoor world that was large enough to contain multiple entire planets. Not only were they never set back in their societal and technological development, but their zero-gravity environment also allowed them to grow brains that were multitudes larger and more complex than we could even imagine, which meant they could casually contemplate concepts that would be incomprehensible to any of the other human species. Eventually, the Spacers came to call themselves the Astromorphs, and they were the closest to gods you could get. So, you know, not the people you want to pick a fight with. The battle may have lasted millions of years, but in the end, predictably, the Astromorphs were victorious over the machines. And so, the Machine Empire came to its end. There's a few more twists and turns to the story of humanity in Ultimoros, like the story of how humanity eventually triumphed over the Q.
Get out of here, Q! No, we are done with random stuff today! We're not dealing with any of your Q bullshit!
But for the purposes of this video, this is a good place to end. While I'm pretty sure it wasn't Kosemen's intention to write such a thoroughly anti-fascist book, he ended up doing so anyway. He shows its irrationality, makes us actually feel bad for all the wonderful kinds of people slaughtered on its altar of purity, and it shows a few of the many reasons it doesn't tend to last. I would advise you to check it out yourself. I didn't spoil all of the story, and most of the fun is in the wildly imaginative post-human species Kosemen conjures up, many of which I didn't even touch on. It's totally free, and there will be a link in the description.
Death to fascism, and have a nice day.
In Ultimoros, C.M. Kosemen writes the following about the Astromorphs. For the first time in history, there were actual gods in the myriad human skies. They were silent and weren't even noticed for most of the time. I can relate with that, because I am also at the mercy of a man-made god who I can neither see nor understand, but who can end my life on this platform whenever he wants to. His name is the algorithm, and though I do not fully understand him, I have managed to figure out that he wants engagement. He wants likes, he wants comments, he wants views on other videos of mine and subscriptions to my channel. If you want to help me stave off his wrath, any of those would be appreciated. Goodbye.